Good afternoon, conference. Firstly, thank you for coming to this final session of conference. There will be survivors' medals available on the way out, just before lunch. It's a great pleasure to introduce this slot with John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor. As Labour Group leader on the LGA, I attended a Shadow Cabinet meeting earlier in the year, and planning ahead, I stood by the stand and had my picture taken with a whole load of Shadow Cabinet members because I thought it would come in really useful. Last weekend, I had to delete those pictures one by one from my computer at home. But what I've found talking to John since his appointment as Shadow Chancellor is a refreshing new attitude towards local government within my party, a sense that we need to end the institutionally centralised mindset and a willingness to work with local government in a way that feels new and different, certainly to me and many of my colleagues. So please welcome John McDonnell MP.
Thank you. Well, it's been a quiet week in Westminster. I'm grateful. I'm really glad to be back at the LGA. Some of you may know that many years ago, I've been both an elected councillor as well as a local government official. I was chair of the finance committee of the GLC way back in the 1980s and its deputy leader. Those are the halcyon days when, as chair of finance on the GLC, I had complete control of the precept, the level of the business rates. I had a £3 billion budget. I had a wonderful relationship with the City of London, and we could do things like build the Thames Barrier. It seems like a dream now of what it is now. Then after that, I became Chief Executive of the Association of London Authorities, a Labour administration, and then the Association of London Government, which was a cross-party group representing London overall. And we did wonderful things then. We set up our own embassy in Europe, the London House, to represent London boroughs and lobby for funds. And I used to administer as the chief executive all the London structural funds and the social funds, all the European funds for London. It just gave me a good grounding on what local government was all about, and also the importance of relationships across party and also across Europe. We're meeting at a time of enormous uncertainty. I know you've been discussing it this week and following the result of the EU referendum just 2 weeks ago. There's wider political uncertainty about Britain's role in the world, and there's economic uncertainty introduced by the shock of the Leave vote itself. Long-standing trading and financial relationships are at risk of being torn up, and we're seeking in Parliament over the last 10 days as much of a bipartisan approach as we possibly can. And last week we had a debate on the economy on an opposition day that we tabled the motion on. But it was not like an opposition day. It was a way in which there was a bipartisan discussion of our problems and where we could work together to tackle the problems the country is now facing. But the clearest message I think that's come out of all the debates so far is that from the vote to leave, business as usual isn't an option anymore. The shock of the Leave vote has been worsened by the shaky foundations of our economy. And some of the facts are quite startling. Productivity growth has stalled since 2007, which is an unprecedented occurrence in modern peacetime history. It's partly as a result of low productivity. Wage growth remains low, and any inflation arising from the falling value of the pound is liable to eat into real earnings. The current account deficit remains at near record levels, whilst borrowing by government and households is also rising. The economy, if anything, is more unbalanced than it was before the crash of 2008. Now, the Chancellor's fiscal rule framework for economic decision-making is no longer operable. I have to say I've consistently argued that George Osborne's fiscal rule, introduced last autumn, had no sound basis in economics. The Chancellor failed to hit his debt target in this year's budget, and the shock to Leave vote and the absence of a plan to deal with that shock has now forced the abandonment of the fiscal surplus target. I think this is actually exactly the right course of action, as also the abandoning of the threatened Brexit budget of further cuts and tax rises. Further austerity would be, I think, absolutely wrong, a wrong course of action to take in the economy buffeted by a shock like Brexit. And let me make it clear, local government has borne much of the brunt of austerity and cannot and should not be the target once again for austerity measures. From the Labour side in this debate, we will continue to press, therefore, for proper funding and resources for our local authorities. But we also need to recognise that our economic policy now must be more than just about accepting the status quo. We have to do more than try and patch up the damage. The Leave vote showed just how decades of underinvestment had left too many people here feeling abandoned by what they quite understandably view as a distant Westminster elite. So we need a break with the old ways of doing things. And I believe it's local councils that actually have started to show the new path that the economy needs in the creation of this new economy. But it has to be matched up by action from central government. And we all recognise, as you've done this week, that the challenges are substantial. Britain today has the worst regional inequality in Europe. The gap between our richest regions and our poorest is wider than that between the north and south of Italy now, and also between the east and west of Germany. In London, we see the richest places in the whole of the EU, but nearly 80% of UK regions earn less than the EU average. And these are the places that tended to vote Leave in the referendum. We shouldn't allow a situation to persist where the majority of investment from both public and private sectors is concentrated in a few areas and great swathes of the country are left behind. So it was important to see the government begin to lay out its vision of the British economy after the Leave vote. George Osborne's commitment made in the Financial Times earlier this week that he was seeking to boost the funding made available to regions in the north of England, from my point of view, is to be welcomed. But we've asked him to set out a timetable for delivering this and some details of the projects to be brought forward. We've also said that local government should be vitally important partners in both designing and delivering this new programme. We're concerned that after the Leave votes, vital EU regional funding that comes to over, well, £10 billion if you add up all the various forms of funding coming from the EU. We're worried that that will simply be lost. Much of this funding, as I know from my own experience, has provided a lifeline of funding for some of the poorest regions in the country and is now at risk. So we'll be pressing the government to address this question urgently. In fact, it's been raised almost on a daily basis in the Commons over the last week. My view is the government must guarantee this funding is protected in the future. The government's austerity policies have reinforced the UK's regional bias. It's local authorities that have borne the brunt of the cuts, but it's then the local authorities in some of the poorest and some in the most difficult financial situations that have been hit the hardest. You know as well as I do that overall local authorities have seen their spending fall by 23% since 2010, allowing for inflation. And these are huge cuts for local councils to bear. But what I've been doing in touring around the country, meeting local authority leaders and others across the country, I've found councils have responded with determination to their deteriorating circumstances forced on them by austerity. And a whole range of examples have come forward just of the creativity that there is in local government to respond. Oldham Council, for example, has looked to develop its own responses to the crisis, working with Oldham Credit Union to reduce the burden of problem debt locally. Its Fair Employment Charter reward local employers and looks to use local authority procurement to improve working conditions. I've noticed Enfield Council in London, they've developed innovative contracting models with major local employers to support good jobs. And Preston, which I visited, inspired by the example of Cleveland, Ohio, has developed an extensive programme of work. Preston was one of the councils facing the very sharpest cuts to its funding out of any in the country, but they're responding, like many of you, creatively. They've got major local employers and buyers, so-called anchor institutions like the University of Central Lancashire, to drive through a local programme of economic transformation. By changing their procurement policies, these anchor institutions were able to drive up spending locally. They're looking to shift a proportion of the Joint Council's £5.5 billion pension fund to focus on local businesses, keeping the money circulating in Preston. And the council's actively seeking opportunities to create local cooperatives as part of a local business succession, working with the local Chamber of Commerce. The aim is to sustain high-quality local employment by giving the chance for workers to keep a business in local hands. These are just a few of the ways in which imaginative local authorities are starting to show a new path for the economy. But we need to scale up and spread initiatives like these. And we have to make devolution a reality where it's not already been achieved. But that doesn't mean passing down responsibility for administering cuts to local and regional authorities, particularly in England. It means ending the concentration of power and wealth in just a few hands in our capital city and giving the powers back to those local areas and places that have been excluded for too long. We need a government that trusts local authorities to find their own economic solutions for their own areas. Labour, we've already had an agreement with our newly elected mayors to set up a mayoral economic forum, helping to bring together the best practices and ideas, and would welcome the LGA representatives to be a part of that. Looking ahead, we need to bring other local authorities on board with their fresh thinking as it's now developing. And I think we can develop a consensus on the approach now to be taken based upon that sort of foundation. Most immediately, for the next steps, there's an urgent need now for some clarity and certainty from government. The lack of planning for the Leave vote has already been damaging for our economy. Economic policy has been pulled together on rather an ad hoc basis over the last 10 days. The centrepiece of the government's macroeconomic policy, the fiscal surplus target, has been ditched, and the Chancellor has now floated the prospect of exceptionally low corporation taxes as a solution to low and falling rates of business investment in the UK. I have to say this is a view I don't share. Previous cuts to corporation tax have not resulted in increasing investment, as the Office of Budget Responsibility has found. And by whittling away at our tax base, cuts to corporation tax put more of a burden on households and small businesses, while increasing the pressure for cuts to local authority spending. So we're adamantly opposed to further cuts in the headline rate of corporation tax that threaten to turn this economy into what Pascal Lamy has described as little more than a tax haven. We need instead some clear parameters for the ongoing discussions with the EU and other international partners about Britain's future role in the world. And I say this, that local government must be represented in those negotiations and decision-making. Local government needs to be at that table as we remake our relationship with Europe. I set out last week some of Labour's red lines for those negotiations on Britain's future relationship with the EU. These seek to ensure that existing rights are protected and that we do not damage the economy and threaten jobs. So, for example, the defence of the banking passport is one of our red lines for the EU negotiations. The banking passport is essential for our financial services industry, since without it, financial institutions from the UK cannot trade in Europe. Another red line is preserving free trade. There's no economic case for reimposing tariff barriers with Europe and depriving British businesses of access to the world's largest single market. And we cannot accept any restrictions on the rights of those who work here. That includes those from other EU countries who presently live and work in the UK. We will not be willing to support any EU deal that reduces the rights available to working people in this country. In addition, we've urged the government to maintain its 16% stake in the European Investment Bank because we receive significant funds from that, 6 billion last year and 1 billion for housing. And it has a credit rating now better than the UK government's own. So the way forward, the Brexit vote should act as a wake-up call for us all. It will force major challenges on local and national leaders alike on the coming years. And our party wants to work in partnership with local authorities as we begin to put together a new political economy for this country. We will seek to ensure throughout that local government's voice is heard and listened to in this challenging period ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And as always, we have time for questions. So what I would ask is if you could indicate, and when I call you, if you could stand up and remind us who you are before you ask your question. Thank you. So let me see who's going first. Okay, over here. I'll take three first.
Yeah, Mike Baldock from Kent County Council. Just hearing all the different people that are saying they should be involved in the negotiations and input into the Brexit talks, I was just wondering if John could give us some idea of where he sees the trade unions fitting into that, because I haven't heard anybody talk about that yet.
Yeah. Okay, let's take another question. Do you have one, number one? No. Another question? Yes, hand up over there. I hadn't appreciated until I'm actually chairing the session myself how difficult it is to see people in the room. So yes, sir.
Thank you. Peter Chowney, leader of Hastings Borough Council. In your support for regional devolution, spare a thought for those of us who are the kind of little islands of red in the seas of blue, particularly in the southeast. We're part of, notionally, a 3SC devolution deal, which is Sussex, Surrey, and East Sussex, West Sussex, and Surrey. But of course, there's very little in that for us. I mean, I have tried desperately to get them to recognise deprivation as just an issue to put into the decentralisation, the devolution bid. But our county council, obviously a Tory county council leader, tells me the government is not interested in deprivation. He may well be right, but I mean, please can we sort of make sure that the issues of deprivation, particularly in coastal communities, but generally in areas that are otherwise at risk of being swamped out by kind of large Tory majorities in these kind of southern and southeast and western regions, that our particular problems in kind of Labour-controlled, more deprived areas are properly recognised.
Yeah. Thank you. And is there another question? Yes, lady here.
Jenny Lynn, Calderdale in West Yorkshire. Housing is what has been quite a hot topic here during the conference, and I know it's something that you've spoken on before, and I wonder if you'd just like to say a little bit about the role that you think local authorities could play in tackling our housing crisis.
Yeah. Okay. I'll come over here. It'll be easier. What's interesting over the last 10 days about, I'll be frank with you, and this is not a partisan point, because in the debates in the Commons so far, and also in the private discussions, what's been absolutely fascinating and worrying about the sort of lack of preparation that there was if the referendum went for leave. And usually what happens, as you know, before a general election, the civil servants will take the manifestos of all the different political parties and they'll work them up, no matter how the betting odds are going in terms of which party will win. And they're at least on the shelf, when there's an incoming government, particularly as a changing government, the civil servants will have the preparations ready to welcome the new Prime Minister and then start working through that manifesto's implementation in a very programmatic way. And what's been extraordinary is that what's been revealed in the debates is the lack of preparation overall for a leave outcome. And I find that extremely worrying. And that's why, as I said in my speech, some of the responses on the economic questions, which I focus on, have been largely ad hoc rather than any form of either short-term, medium-term or longer-term strategy. That's why I think many people now are saying, and representing their organisations, are increasingly saying we need a voice in this discussion so that we ground the government's views as they go into negotiations with our European partners. They ground them on the experience of the real world as people are experiencing it. That's why I think, and this isn't flattering you, but it's because I come from a local government background, that's why I think local government's voice has got to be heard. You're the closest to the people in terms of representation, but also you are deliverers, direct deliverers of services to meet the needs of those people who've just voiced their concerns and views in this referendum itself. Now, with regard to trade unions, the TUC and the trade unions now are getting themselves together. We've already had discussions with a number of trade unions about how we have the trade union voice engaged in this debate. And the big issue for the trade unions at the moment is obviously free movement of people, labour, and the impact that that's had and the way in which in some instances that's motivated a leave vote. And therefore what is required in terms of, as we go into negotiations with our European partners, what is the form of free movement of labour that we'll be able to negotiate, which is based upon protection of employment rights
that are guaranteed in Europe and guaranteed in this country, so no repeal of those rights. And that's part of the agenda. It's one of the red lines that we put in our discussions over the last week, and in a speech I did last week which set out our red lines. So the trade union voice is maybe a bit sotto voce at the moment in those discussions, but it's coming to the fore and is creating its own agenda. Now, I just say from a Labour perspective, with Jeremy Corbyn as leader of our party, we've established a pretty good working relationship now, and based upon Jeremy's relationship with the Socialist and Social Democratic and other progressive movement parties across Europe, and we'll be seeking to use the maximum influence of that to secure the best deal for Europe, but on a cooperative basis. And there's a meeting on Friday of the European Socialist parties with regard to the refugee crisis, but also we're having side meetings about how we can move forward in these discussions. And what we're finding is apart from a bit of, as you'd expect, a bit of French competition for our banking sector, but there you are, you'd expect that anyway. Apart from that, we're finding there's a real will to listen to the concerns that have been emanating from the European referendum campaign, from a trade union perspective and from a Labour Party perspective, because obviously what they're trying to do is ensure that the whole European Union project doesn't unravel, as it seems to potentially could be if certain concerns are not addressed. So that on the point of the question about the trade union voice, that's now beginning to be heard because of this key issue of employment rights linked to the issue of freedom of movement. My position, I support freedom of movement, but I understand the concerns that people have about the undercutting of wages, etc. So it has to be a form of free movement in which those protections are involved in any negotiations. With regard to islands of red, I can't describe myself as red because I'm not allowed to throw any more little red books about the place or anything like that. I think what's interesting that's come up, and I spoke at a CBI meeting on Monday, and what's interesting, it's come up within the debate in Parliament as well, on all sides of the House, that actually this issue around the grotesque levels of inequality in our society has actually now got to be addressed. And that's almost a direct quote from the president of the CBI speaking on Monday. And it's also coming, as I say, from all sides of the House. The vote to leave in the European referendum has caused a shockwave, I think, in the political class, because people are now trying to fathom why did people vote leave. Some it was about, yes, constitutional issues, democratic issues, but there was also, it's almost like a by-election, there was a huge sense of grievance in a number of areas, particularly in the north, northeast and northwest. And that was about this concept of feeling left behind. We've been left behind. And that relates then to levels of inequality and levels of deprivation. And that's why I welcome George Osborne's statement on Monday, that we would then look at an investment programme for those areas in particular, because I think that's the way that infrastructure investment programme, particularly around new technology, that's the way you raise the levels of employment within that area, but also decent jobs with higher wages. So I think, again, in the debate around devolution now, deprivation has got to be put back on the agenda. Otherwise, it won't be just the referendum vote that people will be voting in a ways which people didn't expect. I think it'll be other votes as well, and it might be to parties that many would feel would not be for the long-term benefit of the country. Jenny's point on housing, which I obsess about a bit, that's why she said I've spoken about it before, I suppose. My own constituency issue is one of the most significant issues I'm facing in my community. It's the same with large numbers of MPs across the country. I'll have large numbers of families tonight in my constituency sleeping in bed and breakfast. Many of you will have the same thing. I've got families sleeping in sheds and garages, beds in sheds, rented out to them. In my constituency, we've reinvented I'm from the north, so I know what these were when I was a kid. We've reinvented the back-to-back, where the front of the house is rented to one family, the back of the house is rented to another. Extraordinary high levels of rent as well. Average rents in my constituency between £1,200 and £1,600 a month. People working all hours God sends just to have a roof over their heads. Young people having no chance whatsoever of getting on the housing market. So housing I think is the crisis that we've got to address, because it has, you know better than me, it has social consequences as well. That churning of families from one area to another as they move from one temporary accommodation to another, where the education is then affected. The kids that come home, there's no room for them at home, so they go out on the streets and then they get attracted into gangs. It's all those social consequences of a failure of housing policy for 30 years at least. And again, I think what we need to do now is, from working in local government with central government, is look at a massive housing programme. I want to ensure that we build council houses again, that we work with housing associations. I want to ensure that we work of course, with the private sector. But in some areas, and we're debating this in some areas, it does mean some emergency measures as well, about empty properties. 700,000 properties in this country standing empty, 300,000 of them over 6 months. Again, it's emergency measures about local authorities' responsibilities and roles with those empty properties. And also, I have to say, the debate now is opening fairly widely about rent controls in particular areas and how they can be administered effectively so that we get fair rents back again. So I think the housing crisis, which you bear the brunt of more than anybody, is something that's got to be the top of the agenda of whichever political party is in central government in the next few years. And it will require investment. But now, I just tell you now, the basic economics of this, now's the time when you can borrow to invest, and it will pay for itself in the long term. I've been saying this for the last 9 months since I was appointed Shadow Chancellor, and what really cheered me up no end is Mr Crabb, one of the candidates for the Tory leadership, adopted my policy the other day and called for £100 billion worth of investment on the basis that we can borrow so cheaply. Now, I'm now reconvinced. It's restored my faith in the powers of conversion. And I think that's the way forward for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Time for, I think, one very quick last question if anybody wants to raise anything. There's one, yep, right at the top.
Thank you. Peter Lamb, Crawley. John, you said many things today which I think would have been music to all of our ears, and they reflect comments which you made to me when you helped campaign in my own constituency.
Yes.
We went on to win that ward along with a number of others. The question which I've got to ask is this. While those comments reflect things which we all like, there's been a lot of talk of late of policy being made separate to the party's policy structures. And the big question, I suppose, has got to be, how far has this got buy-in with the wider PLP, and how are you going to get on board the wider PLP in delivering the agenda that you set out before us today?
Yeah. Thanks for the easy question at the end. What I found extraordinary over the last 9 months is this. That when Jeremy Corbyn got elected and we went to our first party conference and we became a party as a result of the decisions there of an anti-austerity party, and we've been developing the ideas about what that means and how both we can ensure a constructive opposition. I don't believe in opposition for opposition's sake. I think you've got to be a constructive opposition, buzzing with ideas, create a climate of opinion where even your opponents then start buying into those ideas because you've won the argument so thoroughly. And that's what we've been trying to do. And we've been, the way Jeremy has constructed his shadow cabinet of left, right and centre just gave people their heads to go out there and create these ideas and bring them back. And that's what we've been doing. And what's amazing about the Parliamentary Labour Party is the vast bulk of them, up until the referendum vote, just wanted to get on with the job of opposing the government, building ideas, campaigning out there and preparing the ground for a Labour government, because that's what we're about. And there's a small group of people who have never accepted Jeremy's mandate, that's the reality of it, and they've generated, this sounds like paranoid, but generated a number of plots. But the thing about it is that they're not very good at plotting. And so we've known what's been coming after each stage of it and just said, look, can't we just calm this down? If there are policy disputes, let's use our democratic structures to enable those policy disputes to be discussed, debated and resolved. And I thought that's where we're at. But after the referendum vote, there seemed to be a sort of hysteria breakout in all the political parties. Nick said bar the Lib Dems, but I don't really want to go there. So again, I just found it really extraordinary. In terms of the development of policies, what's been happening is individual shadow bench frontbenchers and their teams have been setting up various commissions and reviews, and then we were trying to feed that. We were just at the stage last month of feeding that into our national policy framework, and we'd had a national policy forum booked for a week ago, and that would roll out to the Labour Party conference for its first debate around the future of policy. And again, because of what happened after the referendum, that's all been delayed. So we've been following the traditional structures of the Labour Party parliamentary making process. I have to say, from many people's points of view, it's a bit archaic, and we need to pep it up a bit, particularly with the use of digital technology, etc., to involve people more. But that was going on apace, and some of the stuff that was coming out I thought was brilliant. John Healey did his report and review about how you can use housing benefits to create 100,000 new properties. Again, extremely creative. I set up this Economic Advisory Council. I had them touring around the country, holding seminars, lectures, raising the whole level of economic debate. And it's interesting, the work that we've done that we were going to present through the Policy Forum onto conference, virtually every organisation I've met in terms of both sides of industry are virtually on the same page of us about sorting out the tax system, make it fairer, long-term patient investment, the role of you as an entrepreneurial state at local and at national level, looking at identification of new technology so we rebalance our economy. We're not just the financial centre for Europe, but with a new technology innovation centre as well. So all that was going on apace and is still there and is still open for everyone to get involved in. So I'm hoping, and I think it's happening already, things calm down now. People said, look, if we want to resolve problems, we should have a leadership election, and democratically that will then decide who the leader is, etc. I don't want a leadership election, but if that's going to happen, let's get on with it. But I don't think it will now. I think what's happening in the discussions that we're having with the trade unions involved as well, we can reach an amicable agreement on a way forward. And if there are issues around policy making, about being more inclusive, which I think we have been, if there are issues, let's sort that out, find out what structures people feel more engaged in. But it isn't just the PLP that needs to be in the policy making. Our rank and file members want a voice in that policy making process, and we've got to engage with them, as same as our trade union affiliates. If it is about how we perform in representing those policies, again, let's see how we can improve that. But let's just talk about it rather than just resigning and walking away from the job. You know, when I've been on a Labour group on a council, to be frank, you know, if you disagree with something, you have a disagreement in the Labour group, you come to a democratic decision, and then you go ahead and you represent the party you're elected to represent. And I think that I want to get back to that sort of spirit of cooperation. And for those in the Labour Party, as you know, we have a concept called comradeship. I know it sounds a bit old-fashioned, but I still believe in it. In other words, we cooperate, and we're best when we work together rather than we resist each other and we have these splits. So I'm hoping it's calming down and we'll be able to move on. But the policy making, I found really exciting. I found a whole range of people coming up with extraordinary ideas on the environment. Again, John Trickett was about to launch his constitutional convention about how citizens become more involved, local government. You were going to come forward with your ideas about restructuring or new powers that you wanted. And it was all about, you know, what is socialism for me? Socialism is the achievement of equality through democracy. So it's about how you create that more equal society, but through a democratic process. And what could be more effective in playing that role of instilling democracy in our society than local government? And that's why we've committed so much to it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Rather appropriately, the red light has come on now, so that tells me that time is up for this session. Can we thank John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, for taking the time to address us today. And now only one thing stands between you and lunch, and that is Gary Porter.
Thanks, Nick. It's just as well it's me then, because I am going to probably be the briefest person that you'll ever get up at this stage. Can I just thank John before he leaves off the stage for saying comments that Greg started at the beginning of the week, saying local government needs to be front and centre on this stuff and getting it sorted out. You've closed it by saying local government needs to be front and centre on getting this sorted out. And that's been a constant theme throughout this conference. We are going to be the only people who are going to get a solution to this. Neither side of the Brexit campaign had a baldric working for them. There is no cunning plan. We have to be the solution. And I just kind of want to thank everybody for coming to the conference. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I want to thank Nick and the other group leaders for making sure the group's discipline has worked here as well as it didn't work anywhere else in either side in Westminster, because at least we do know how to play nicely together, so that's a great result for us. I need to thank the staff who've laid on the conference. You all know how difficult it is to make a conference work, particularly if you stand this side of it, you see the actual legwork that goes into it, months and months of planning, months and months of panicking, and then when it's all over, they all have a sigh of relief for about a week till we make them start doing it all over again. So if you could just show your appreciation for the staff who've laid it on. I'd like to thank the members of Parliament who have come and stayed and shared time with you. You've had FaceTime with them in the bar, you've been able to bend their ears. People who've been in there haven't hidden away. I saw Steve and Greg having a bit of a set to with each other last night, but it all smiled in the end, so that looked quite nice. Just a couple of things. Nick said thank you for staying and you deserve a prize. I haven't checked this out with the Chief Executive yet, but I think we can have a prize, and that's probably going to be if you buy your tickets for next year before anybody else, then we can guarantee you can come next year. Can we make that? We can do that one. And just basically, if you haven't liked anything, make sure you feed it in, because we don't want this to be a repeat of anything that didn't work next year, so get that fed in. And can I wish you a safe and a happy trip back to wherever it's you've come from. And please, please, please do what we say we're going to do. Make sure we are front and centre on fixing most of the problems that are going to come our way over the next year. I think it's a real opportunity. If there isn't that Baldrick in the team, we are in the right place. And I know the parliamentary parties have seemed to have imploded on themselves in some bizarre way this last couple of weeks, but that's a real opportunity for us, a real strength for us. And John said it about the Labour guys, he's true. You've got some fantastic leadership in local government. I'm also going to say it for the same for the Blue team. They've got some fantastic leadership in local government, and it's the same for the Lib Dems, and it's the same for the Independents, although I'm not really sure how Marion manages to merge all of the fantastic leadership from polar ends of the same argument together, but she seems to be pulling that together. So can I just thank you for the work that you do that makes us look so good, and for the work that you've done that's made both the main parties want to make sure that we're front and centre on whatever they put up as a solution. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a safe trip back. Thank you.